are you listening to? Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn. I'm Kim.
I'm Carolyn.
So we have a great discussion ahead of us. We recently covered some topics dealing with mental health, especially the emphasis on adolescents. And just a couple years ago, we had a very famous for being famous person walk the halls of our legislature and brought to light some concerns about residential treatment.
Yeah. It was the most popular bill of the session, not because of what was contained within the bill.
Right. But because of who was, this was celebrity status, again, walking the halls of our legislature, giving testimony in our committees. And so it brought to light some concerns and some histories dealing with residential treatment center, but it may have cast an unfavorable light on the good ones, which is sometimes what happens when you make public policy. Sometimes it captures the good actors with the bad actors when there have been incidences that you want to
and even with. On top of that, I think oftentimes in public policy you are not able to completely capture the entire essence of an issue. Frequently, especially when it's something that the media jumps on and you have some celebrity status around it, whether it be because there's an actual celebrity or because the media has turned it into something big, right? So the actual discussions that dig into both sides of the issues and being able to really understand what's going on and why gets lost in all of the kind of excitement around the games that the media oftentimes plays.
Okay, well, so let's talk about maybe some of the unintended consequences of that legislation. Again, that got this media attention, a little bit of media circus around a high profile. We haven't said her name yet. But
we haven't. Paris Hilton.
What? Okay, so we have with us, we're going to talk about residential treatment centers. We have with us tonight Ken Huey, who is the CEO of Havenwood Academy right here in Cedar City. And we're also going to talk with Megan Stokes, who is the executive director of the largest trade association of therapeutic schools and programs. And usually, typically, these residential treatment centers have a component of the education side while they're dealing with some pretty intensive cases and challenges dealing with mental health. So let's welcome Ken Huey on. Tell us a little bit about Havenwood Academy right here in Utah. How many clients, students do you have, and what are the conditions that would bring a student to your facility?
You bet. At any given time, we've got 35 to 42 students in our program, and they're typically coming from pretty rough backgrounds, foster care system of the U.S. generally, but also international adoptions, and they will have been frequently physically abused, emotionally neglected, sexually abused, have family dysfunction with parents that are mentally ill, and that kind of stuff, not all of it necessarily. And then as they hit their teenage years, you can imagine that all of that trauma starts playing out. They have a real hard time socially. They're maybe bombing out of school and running away from home and just struggling with their behaviors. And they'll then come to our facility, and we try to give them a real high-level private pay experience, but to the public pay kids. And that's the kid that we treat.
Okay. And what might the length of stay be in your center?
Yeah. Typically, they're right at 12 and a half months is how long they come and stay. It takes a while to basically rewire the brain. If you're in trauma situations on a consistent basis, it kind of turns on the fight or flight area of the brain, the limbic system, and that has you then just acting out in really kind of antisocial, weird ways. And you have to get them to where pro-social behavior becomes normal, and they know how to function in society, and that takes about a year to kind of bake in, and then we send them back home and they live with parents. We have about an 81% success rate.
81%. And so why can't they just stay home and get outpatient treatment? Really, where's this line where now residential treatment is really necessary or most beneficial?
Yeah, you bet. I think if a kid can be helped in outpatient therapy, they ought to be. Stay at home, for heaven's sakes. But for some kids, kind of like getting, chemotherapy for cancer, outpatient therapy is kind of cough syrup and works when you've got a common cold. But if you've got cancer, you need pretty intensive intervention that is tough. It's hard on the body, frankly, has some side effects that you've got to go through, loss of hair with chemotherapy and loss of appetite and throwing up and such. Well, we have kids that, might come in and start cutting on themselves and having extra issues. Their behavior might actually get worse for a little period of time, but they need that level of care. They're not making it in an outpatient setting. They're starting to, like I say, run away from home. You think, well, we just need to do outpatient. Well, what are you talking about when a kid has taken off and been gone for 4 days and come back and they've tried heroin, or they're getting in fistfights with teachers and kids, and you just can't quite control that? Well, that then becomes a place where you go, oh, you know what? We really need to send you away somewhere and try and control all of the variables, like bad friends and drugs and bad music and just things that get in the way, and let you work on your core issues. That's when residential makes sense.
Okay, so I wanted to establish that this really is a level of more intrusive, more intensive treatment, because lesser intrusive measures are not working. So these aren't parents that just say, I can't deal with it, go lock them up in another state. This really is the therapeutic modality that is best for this client.
For sure. So, I've got 20 years in this world, this industry, if you will. And if this kid was living in my home, I would not be able to control it. When I've got, 90 staff at my fingertips that can be helping kids kind of get where they need to go emotionally and physically and safety wise, you can control the variables and help them get better. Yeah, this is not your average environment. These are kids that, absent our intervention, are likely to be in juvenile detention, for instance.
Okay, so then, what is that prognosis then if you're not available? And you may have times where you don't have enough beds available. Do you have a waiting list at times?
We do have a waiting list at times. There's usually kind of a decrease towards the end of summer, and so we had a little bit of a dip, and now we're back to full or just about full, and we'll be on a waiting list in probably 3 weeks. So and then when you don't have a place like us to come to, kids, actually, we had a girl who came to us, for instance, about 2 months ago, who sat for 16 months or 18 months, I forget, in juvenile detention. They could not find a bed for her to get the kind of care she needed.
Okay, so for some of these students, this is also not just necessary therapeutic, but it really is getting them out of some pretty bad situations as well, where the prognosis is bad, is grim.
Yeah, for sure. And, untreated trauma is sort of the genesis of personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, multiple personality disorder, those kinds of issues, narcissistic personality disorder. That's where it is bred. And those then are sort of our future inmates of America, club card holders without treatment. They're not bad kids. They're just struggling. They are troubled for good reason and need to heal so that they don't play out the rest of that trauma cycle.
Okay, so let's bring this fast forward to what happened here in Utah that put residential treatment on. Let's have Megan join us, and maybe confront a little bit the history that this celebrity was really trying to address. And really, did they get to the right spots on this? Because really, spoiler is we're going to talk about how maybe that did overreach and did have an unintended consequence for the facilities that are doing a lot of good for these
and
children.
Let me say, unintended consequences not only for the facilities, but children who otherwise would be treated but now aren't being treated.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, and really, primarily, that's what we care. We care about the children first, but that the facilities can operate in a way that can treat these people. So can we bring Megan on as well, Fazamu?
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. So what was Paris Hilton really trying to address, and maybe what parts of that might have been legitimate, but did we go too far, or did we not address appropriately what she intended to?
I really love the phrase you used earlier about unintended consequences, because there's a lot that came out of that bill, and some were poor unintended consequences that impact the families. And the other ones were actually good for programs. It's opened up this really great dialogue with the Department of Health and Human Services, where we've had monthly phone calls to talk about the new rules as they're being created to fall in line with that legislative piece. We've also opened up new dialogues with legislators, where for so many years, because of stigma and NIMBYism and that sort of thing, you may not even have known that you had a program down the street. They were just they were doing their job and heads down. And now they're like, well, come visit us. Come see who we are. We're not these horror stories you hear. We are an open and transparent organization. Talk to our kids, talk to the families that we've served in the past. So that's been kind of a nice unintended consequence, is to have that relationship develop, not just with the regulators, but also with the legislators as well.
Okay. And so that's always good, is when we open up dialogue and we can have a wider range of things that we discuss, especially when there is so much emphasis right now in our state and I guess across the country regarding youth mental health, suicide prevention. These are some very tough topics that we're all trying to address. But you, as a trade association for these schools and treatment centers, therapeutic schools and treatment centers, what are you seeing across the country, and what did we do here right, and maybe where did we miss the mark?
It's been interesting. Some of the changes made absolute sense. Okay, let's have unannounced visits from licensors. Great. That makes sense to kind of update some of the rules around the staff to student ratios, what would be appropriate, making sure the students know who to contact if there's a concern. That made a lot of sense. And the programs who are Joint Commission accredited, CARF accredited, COA, there's these different national accrediting bodies. We're kind of already doing that. So a lot of these programs were like, great, this just brings everybody up to these nice standards, and let's get rid of any bad actors that are out there. Across the nation, it's been very interesting. We've been pushing for some legislation in a couple of states that would, in Montana, there's a faith-based exemption. So you do not have to register relicense as a program if you're a faith-based program. We're hoping to next year get that exemption removed so that licensure oversight is available for all. In Missouri, that was recently removed. I'm expecting to see some really great stuff come out of the state of Missouri as we bring more programs. They're not NATSAP members, but all programs you want to bring up to those higher standards. So it is one of those where we see what's happening, but on the other hand, there's no beds. There's no space for these kids who need help. If a kid has school refusal before COVID, they really have school refusal now. There's a lot of concern about being addicted online, to your phone, to Instagram, TikTok, whatever you're seeing and not realizing that's not real, and what that's doing for kids' self-esteem issues. That leads to that self-harm. Dr. Huey talked about that a little bit beforehand, about these kids who are coming from places with capital T trauma and the help they need, the safe space they need. We have other programs where they may not be working with kids with as much trauma in their background, but boy, you need to really create a safe space for these kids to kind of make sure that they get the therapy they need. The family gets the therapy as well. That's a huge part of the process, because that kid can put in a ton of work, but if you're going back to that same environment, it's not going to work. And it's one of those where we talked a little about where a kid comes beforehand. And the research that NATSAP has done with the University of New Hampshire, 90% of the kids have done some form of outpatient therapy, with a personal private therapy lessons, group sessions, family therapy. Of that 90%, 43% had inpatient psychiatric care. I mean, you are 100% right. This is not the kid who mouths off and then is told you're going over a state line. These are kids who have kind of exhausted their community resources, and then they have to go that higher level of care.
Okay, so where did we miss the boat? Because there's always the concern if you want the regulation to be appropriate to protect the health and safety and civil rights and things like that for students. But frequently we find that regulation then can impede the work if it's too heavily regulated. So I understand that we didn't balance this very well, and that some of that, one of those unintended consequences is maybe some of these residential treatment centers may not want to take some of the toughest children or children that they may deem will pose a higher risk to them being able to comply with the new regulations. So maybe we can have Ken address that. How does the new law and the new evolving regulations impact your ability to treat some of these students?
Yeah, you bet. So there was an intended kind of consequence of, let's get a little more oversight. Okay, fine. We really don't have a problem with that. But it was such a cattle prod to the state legislators. I don't blame not legislators, but the state licensing. They felt such a need to have oversight that it's really kind of it's made them have to be really onerous. And I don't blame them. They're getting all kinds of yelling and stuff coming at them. So it helps maybe if I tell a quick story. So, 4 years ago, we had an equine director, a contract employee who got frustrated with a kid and was trying to control her, who was with our program and was acting out. She put zip ties on her and stuck her in a horse trough with some water in it. Stupid. 4 years ago. That day, within hours, we called the police on ourselves, called state licensing on ourselves, took care of it immediately, suspended her, trained her up and got her so we'd never have an issue like that, and just fixed it. No big deal. 4 years ago, we didn't think a thing about it again, other than we want to fix that kind of an issue. Well, now out comes all this noise with Paris Hilton and McKell trying to make a name for himself. By the way, we've invited that joker to our program 6 times in writing. 6 times. They won't even respond to us. We've invited this, there's one reporter that's just going after programs. We've invited her to our program with unlimited access. Talk to any of the kids you want to, talk to parents, talk to our staff, and they won't do it because it doesn't fit the narrative that we're somehow bad.
Yeah.
So anyway, we get all that kind of attention, and now this thing from 4 years ago blows up, and she puts that in the papers, doesn't mention that we reported ourselves, for heaven's sakes. Well, now we're in a place where, okay, we got to sort of bring our profile down a little bit, which includes not taking kids that are tough. If we're going to have holds that happen appropriately, we're just going to get state regulators in our offices enough that we're going to cease to be able to do business just by volume of their calls in to see us.
Right.
And so we've rejected at least 16 kids since all this went down that were the toughest kids, and now they're in juvenile detention instead of getting care. Instead of getting better, they're in a holding pattern. They'll age out, they'll become 18, and then they'll be off on the streets. They might be prostituting, they might be using, they'll be into jails and prisons after that. That's where we've blown this. We're losing the ability to capture some of the most of our vulnerable kids.
So tell me, when this bill was going through the legislature, how much were you and people like you brought to the table to have a discussion about the potential negative consequences of some of that?
And parents.
Yeah.
Parents of students.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, let's be clear. We weren't brought to the table for a single scintilla of a second. We demanded a seat and ultimately created it, thanks to Megan, too, and everybody at NatSap, and did some just really hard work to really slow this down and get better legislation than initially was proposed. It still had problems, but hey, fine. so we did get a seat at the table and helped move this a little bit. There's still then unintended consequences that are creating issues for programs, including, just onerous oversight that has everybody dumbing down the level of client they can take. And those are the kids that need it the most. We're taking a middle of the road kid.
Right. Yeah. A middle of the road kid who probably has other options as well for treatment, I would assume.
Sure. They probably need residential, but it's a kid that's going to be easier to take care of in residential. That, maybe they wind up getting into a hold once in a while. We used to have a facility where well-trained staff could get into holds and nobody was going to yell at them for that. It was what we needed to be able to keep kids safe. But we went from having that quite frequently, and that's fine, to reporting every single hold. And we had to just eliminate holds, which meant eliminate the tougher kids.
Okay, so explain what a hold is for people who may not know what that is.
Thank you. That's a good point. That's kind of unique to this industry. So if you've got a kid taking a swing at another kid, or taking a swing at staff, or wanting to run and take off into traffic, in the middle of the day, you grab a hold of them in a prescribed way. First, you try and talk them down, but then you actually lay hands on in a way to control their movement, not to harm them in any way, and keep them from doing something that would hurt themselves or others. And it used to be that we were willing to do that as much as necessary. Now we need to minimize that, or the state is constantly in our offices. And if you report yourselves, which we do every single hold, and they start to come in 3 or 4 times a week, which was happening at the beginning of this, it's incredibly time consuming. One visit is going to be 4 to 6 hours, 8 hours of of many different people spending that kind of time to try and take care of that report. Ultimately, it works out just fine, but you can't do business. The therapist is busy, the clinical director, the CEO, HR is jumping into it. And so what you have to do is just say, forget it. We can't take a kid that creates more holds and then the state's showing up.
Yeah.
To be very clear, when a hold can happen is very strictly spelled out in law. They have to be a risk to themselves, a risk to other staff, students. It can't be like non-cooperative. We have to be, so to be very clear. But the other unintended consequences from the bill were things that, if a student gets dysregulated in a class and they need to leave, to calm down, to take a moment, because you're trying to de-escalate and not have a hold, that became something where you had to report. Well, I don't necessarily think it's right to report if that kid's able to take 15 minutes, get it together, get back into class. I think it's important to report if that seclusion occurs for longer than an hour. Then yes, they're being secluded from their peers and their staff, But if you can sit with them and work with them on calming down exercises, on mindfulness, being present in the moment, discussing their triggers, then that should not count as a seclusion. And under the current rules, it was. So it was something where this was like a therapeutic moment that was occurring between staff and a student, and was seen as a negative thing. And it's like, well, no, this is a good thing. You want that kid to be able to get the resolve so that they can self-regulate, get themselves back to the class or back to whatever was happening, and not have it be a report if they're able to handle it in 30 minutes or less.
Yeah.
So there's just different things where everything became a violation, where you could have late paperwork, and that was on the same level as a violation that would be around health and safety. So the State Department of Health and Human Services, to their credit, is really trying to work on changing, making an infraction for the smaller things and a violation for when it actually is important, and trying to make some changes to the language around seclusion at the request of programs who said, hey, this is kind of stigmatizing this kid more. Now they have to go meet with a licensor for what in their mind was a hiccup. I had a moment, and yes, that moment might have lasted a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily rise to that level. And the kid was safe, and that's really kind of the important piece. That kid was safe and was practicing their techniques and what they had been learning.
Can I piggyback on what Megan's saying too? we run a pretty tight ship with a trauma-informed residential treatment center. And we don't let just anybody walk in without talking through and giving some prep to the kids so they recognize that it's going to happen and they can emotionally prepare. Now we've got state investigators showing up, demanding to come in and walking around, unimpeded. And it's actually quite scary for the kids. They don't know what's going on. Why is that person sitting in the conference room and constantly pulling in all these kids? And we don't control their environment very well when we're doing that. We want to control that and keep it calm and we say that he who controls the rhythms controls the house, the emotional rhythms. And part of the way that you do that is maintaining the environment in a really good way.
Yeah, and these are kids too who've probably had some interaction with the law, with government officials in other ways that is most likely negative, right?
Yeah.
And so I would assume that the emotions involved just in that, are they here for me? Did I do something?
Some other triggers, some trauma triggers.
Yeah, some other kind of issue going on there as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, so now you're at the table, and that's a really good thing. But are there more regulations, laws on the horizon? What are you watching, and what do people need to know about?
Sure.
Yeah.
So right now, Senator McCall is not planning to run anything for the upcoming legislative session. We've been told that a couple times. He'd really like to see DHHS and the programs kind of work out what can be worked out through regulation changes, not through legislative changes. On the horizon, on a larger view, we do know there's going to be a federal bill that's going to come out. The name has changed a few times. It could be the Stop Institutionalized Child Abuse Act, or it could be the Accountability and Congregate Care Act. Either way, boy, Washington loves a long name. But it is one where we do see that there's some federal things that are going to come out. We're not sure what that's going to look like. NATSAC has actually been pushing a federal bill for last 2 years now, over 2 years, trying to create standards across the states. And this is just something where we would love to be able to pluck from the states who do it well. Some wilderness therapy standard from Idaho and the standard for residential treatment in Utah, and just kind of help to create something that would be really helpful across all states. But the feds move a lot slower than the states do. So I think it's going to be relatively quiet on the legislative front for states this year, at least for Utah. And we'll see what else comes up. But I think a lot of that the programs have done a great job working with the licensing teams to kind of explain their point of view. I think that's being heard finally.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask, you say it sounds like, it seems as though those concerns are being heard. I'm curious, and maybe you don't have a full feel for it at this point, but I'm curious how much of this you think can be accomplished within the state through the regulatory bodies as opposed to legislatively. Can a lot of this be resolved, do you think, just working with the regulators at this point?
At this point, I think a lot can be resolved working with the regulators because the framework of what is required is already in place. So we already have standards for what would be an appropriate time to do a restraint or to talk about when a seclusion has occurred. And we can make changes to that with them explaining, okay, here's why this isn't feasible in the real world.
Oh, okay.
And so I think a lot more can be done through the regulatory process. And the legislative process, it's very short legislative session. Mm-hmm. It can be a circus, and it can be something where who can speak and who's at the table is not necessarily those who are going to be impacted by changes moving forward.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
So great. Thank you.
So thank you so much. And I think it's just important to know that there's a role for the residential treatment center in those most extreme cases, and where these students may not have anywhere else to go or may experience their only options might pose more risk for additional trauma. And so thank you so much for coming on. And we'll just keep watching. Is there a particular place where people can go to learn more about what's happening in this space? Maybe Megan, do you have resources for that?
Sure. So on our website, which is www.natsap.org, we have data from the University of New Hampshire. We have questions to ask for parents who are looking at placement options. We have a directory of our program members. What's really unique is you'll find every program is student profile specific. They know who they work best with. So it is one of those where it's really great to kind of read through. And please go check out Havenwood Academy. They've got testimonials from parents and students. And sorry, Ken, your website looks pretty great these days. So I want to plug it.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be with you.
All right, now we have on with us Candace, who has a daughter who's been at Havenwood. We also are joined still by Ken Huey, CEO of Havenwood Academy. And Candace, so thank you both of us for joining us. Candace, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about why you chose Havenwood, what your experience has been like with your daughter there, and just give us some feedback as a parent watching this process, knowing the before and the after and the middle.
Okay, so I'm kind of in the middle right now.
Okay.
Hopefully towards the latter part of the middle, which is a better place to be than the beginning.
Yes.
So it's tough choosing a facility, and honestly, I went through the process all myself, and it was really hard. Sometimes when you do it, it's not really up to you so much as it is whether the facility is willing to accept your child. And that being said, like there's two parts to that. Sometimes it's not the best place for your child, and they don't, they're not specialized in those particular needs or the individual children that they have at the facility at the time. It would kind of mix things up, and it would make it more problematic for the youth that are already there. So there are a lot of things that factor into it. Frankly, I ended up hiring an education counselor. And an education counselor is someone that knows the facilities in not only the state, but like the nation. They visit them, and they know who has significant turnover for therapists. They know the particular strategies or modalities that they use for therapy, like if they have equine or if they have art therapy or if they do yoga, all of that kind of thing. And so she really helped me. She was instrumental in helping me choose Havenwood.
Tell us about your experience with your daughter there. What kinds of changes have you seen to date?
So we've kind of gone through the whole gamut of things. Prior to her coming to Havenwood, she had literally like 2 months of testing done at University of Utah Huntsman program. And even having since with all that testing, Havenwood still has determined additional needs for her and sought out additional testing. We've gone through the whole gamut of medications and that kind of thing, prescriptions. They have so many tools available. They have different houses. So if one house isn't really working because of the youth that they have and because of the personalities there, then they can try another one. And that also, that was beneficial recently. It kind of gave her a fresh start. And that's a real positive for kids when they just get so stuck.
Yeah.
So she's had that. They have determined that she does need non-traditional therapy. She doesn't do so good in talk therapy. So consequently, she's really doing better through art therapy. and also other neurofeedback type of things that they have available. So just lots of tools to work with that really have helped her come around. It was a struggle in the beginning. It still is a struggle and it always will be a struggle. But when you're at the beginning, you really actually kind of tend to have the potential to lose hope. And with hope, there's nothing. So I'm super hopeful for the future because of where she's at right now. She's been there about 9 months. And there's no telling what the duration, there's no such thing as typical. But typically, I guess, like somewhere 9 to 18 months or something, I think is the average.
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
Where do you think you would be if you didn't have this choice?
Well, I hate to think about that option. Obviously, I did everything within my power prior to having this choice. Like, these resources are, they're unfortunately outside of additional facilities that are similar. There really just are no answers. But whenever she had that testing at University of Utah, they told me, like, you cannot do this at home. You can try, but you will not succeed. You have to have additional outside resources, or things will get worse before they get better. And what Havenwood provides is boundaries that so many kids need, like these strict, like structured boundaries where someone is there 24/7. That's really not possible for any normal parent or parents, or even two-parent households.
So I'm curious, your daughter, you talked about it being hard at the beginning. Change is always hardest at the beginning, I think, right? It doesn't mean it gets easy at any point, but how has her perspective about Havenwood and her experience there, has that changed during her time there? What's her feedback?
Well, initially when she came, she just obviously thought that it was like she didn't belong there. Every other people belong there. And then they blame the parents a lot. And she's come around to determine that really actually she does have some stuff to work on. But that's a process. It's a process for any teenager, right? Like, that's really hard stuff. I guess it's hard for us as adults to be like, but I don't need to change you, So, but that being said, I do need to change. Like, this is a 2-part process, which is super beneficial as far as Havenwood goes, because they do literally have parent trainings, and they do have resources and books that they suggest, and they do really include you as much as is wise to include a parent. But it's a learning process. It really is very helpful and very like enlightening or whatever about me and about my interaction with my child and with other people. It's very helpful.
So are you concerned that new laws and new regulation may impede the ability to offer this level of therapy for your daughter? As you've been engaged in this last couple, years.
Under a year, yeah.
So is that a concern that you share, that the laws, the regulations might impede the ability to treat your daughter the way it's been recommended?
So there's already so many things against you in this situation, and there's such a huge need more now than ever for these mental health facilities. And I think that mental health we hear it all the time. Like, it doesn't get people don't get it. They need it. That's why there's so many problems in societies, because it doesn't get like the credit that it needs. And it's already been like super, super challenging for me to get insurance coverage and stuff. And there is a component where like so say if a kid does good for like 1 or 2 months, then they think they don't need it anymore. But really, this is the way it goes. So you need to have some longevity for some change to really be like concrete before they're dismissed. But a lot of times it's pretty significant cost to the parent. And if there weren't these treatment centers, which, it's a hard thing for the treatment centers to be in business and to function and to do all that they have to do within the laws. It's hard. It's just all hard. There's no easy answer, but without them, like, I don't even know. I can't imagine. As a parent, like, to deal with this on your own at home, it's not really an option. I already had like in-house behavior counseling, like in-house. I already had therapists. I already went the gamut of all the options without this, as people do. I even tried wilderness therapy, and that's great, and it works for some people. But the thing is that a facility like Havenwood is what is key and what does work for this particular child. Wilderness works for some kids, and that's great, but there needs to be a variety.
So based on your, I'm just curious, based on your experience that you've had these last 9 months, are there holes that you think exist from what you've seen within, the facility, the experiences that your daughter has had? Do you feel like there needs to be greater regulation? Do you feel like some of her progress has been impeded? And this may be really difficult to judge as a parent, right? But some of the treatments that maybe would be helpful to her have been impeded because of the regulatory environment. Or is that not something that you're able to really have any perspective on?
Or maybe Ken might be able to answer that too, because you've been with Havenwood for about 9 months, did you say?
2 years.
But Candace has been with you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what's been the difference in the actual execution of therapy and services since the new law, and how might it impact?
I don't know that Candace would know that, though, right?
Yeah.
Well, are you saying that's a Ken question?
Yeah, I think maybe a Ken question. Do you now approach providing therapy and services to Candace's daughter maybe in a different way now since the laws?
Yeah, so Candace's daughter in particular, not so much, but again, it takes the ability to work with some kids kind of off the table. Yeah. So, the old maxim is that if it moves, tax it. This is the government philosophy. If it moves, tax it, keeps moving, regulate it, stops moving, subsidize it. Okay, we're regulating it now. And we're going to regulate it out of existence if we're not careful. And if we do that, we're going to subsidize it. We're going to have to. Yeah. We got to change then and make juvenile detention in jails more therapeutic. And we'll try that. That won't work. And we'll be back where we were. So we just don't want to. Don't regulate us out of existence. Havenwood's healthy. We're going to be okay. We'll get through this. We're not going to treat some of the kids we would otherwise, but we'll get through it. But some of those that maybe don't have the financial wherewithal and length and longevity to survive some of this crazy legislation and attacks, they're going to be driven out of business. We've seen a few of them leave. And you just don't want that. You want to be able to take care of Candace and her daughter.
Well, and Candace made this point as well. And when I was working, I think it was when I was working for the speaker. Anyway, maybe it was after that. But when we had Medicaid expansion, one of the things that when I was talking to service providers in the Salt Lake Valley, there was a crunch because it was so difficult to hire. Services had expanded so much that there was no way to keep up with the hiring in order to provide the necessary services. So it seems to me, and Candace made this point about the demand that exists, right? There's such a demand. And if we make it more difficult for the service providers that do exist, who already are struggling to do it on, it may be the amount of money that's coming through the insurance companies or through Medicaid expansion or just hiring the people that they need in order to adequately staff and give treatment. When we add one more layer of bureaucracy and difficult, I can see how for some it would be advantageous to say, I'm done, I'm making a change in my business model, or like you guys, we'll treat different types of people, and those who need it the most aren't getting care for whatever reason.
You lose talented people too. Two people I can talk to right now. One gentleman, a friend of mine, Jack, who just said, I'm done taking care of other kids' people. This just isn't worth it anymore. And he left. He left the field of teen treatment. He was an executive director. Well, hold on. He's an executive director. Another one who was an executive director, same thing, left and became a college professor because he was just done. It was easier to deal with academia and all the baloney than to have this kind of pain all the time. I'm an adoptee. I have a trauma history that is significant. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. Because I have this history, I want to help my people. And the state wants to make it so freaking painful that people like me quit doing it. Now, I'm not giving up, but we got to stop punishing those that are trying to help because it's a messy process. Of course it's messy. Me, as a teenager, I'd have been hell on wheels in a treatment center. That's okay. We need to keep having these treatment options.
Yeah. Well, and it seems to me as well that there is an overlooking maybe of the reality of the situation that you guys are dealing with, right? Or we put that aside and we want it to look in your centers like it looks in a home where children, maybe have a few mental health issues, but don't have the significant trauma that a lot of your children are dealing with in your center and others like yours.
Yeah, and then you get panicked when some kid, in a treatment center injures themselves or attempts suicide. Wait a minute, you know the numbers that we've got, the numbers that we stop from having a suicide attempt, but you're focusing on the one or two that succeed. If a kid is committed to suiciding or attempting, I don't care how good the place, they're going to get that attempt. The most suicides you have are in psych hospitalizations and in residential treatment because it's the sickest kids. Yeah. If they were out of our facility, you'd have 10 times the number of those kids dying or having really close attempts.
So would you just quickly talk to us about when you mentioned at the beginning that you have an 81% success rate. So what are the parameters for measuring that? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And this is really important. 81% success rate means that our kids finish treatment and never again, 81% of the time, never again need psych hospitalization, law enforcement intervention, or out-of-home placement. Oh my goodness.
That's huge.
And our kids, ours typically, they average 3 or more psych hospitalizations, 2 to 8 other residential placements and out-of-home placements. I mean, they're bombing out, and we stop that cycle. They're always going to be kind of an intense kid, but they stop needing all this intervention, which would also include, prison and stuff too. They get off the treadmill, and they start having a productive life.
So their ability to self-regulate so many of the emotions and the actions that go along with those emotions increases, and it's not just when they're in the controlled environment.
That's right. Normal becomes normal. So I always say that for our kids, normal human interaction, like touch, safe touch, is actually abnormal. It's scary and frightening to them. And so they react to normal around them in very abnormal ways. And we get them to a place where normal is normal, and abnormal, somebody exploiting them, that's abnormal. And they stop doing the exploitative stuff, and they exhibit pro-social emotions and behaviors, and they function.
Well, thank you so much. And Candace, also thank you for sharing your story with us. And we're going to bring on Dave Owen in just a minute. So
Okay, thank
and
you.
he's going to wrap up this segment for us. But
All right.
thank you so
Great.
much, Ken and Candace.
Thank you.
You can-
Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
Best
bye.
of luck. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So to wrap things up, we have Dave Owen from Salt Lake City, and no one really knows what Dave does. He has some involvement in this situation and others, but I have no explanation for.
But Dave is the one you want to have.
Yeah, he's. You see him here and there in the shadows around the Capitol.
And you like hear Darth Vader music in your head when Dave Owen.
No.
Literally, I was telling, we were at an event last weekend that Dave had been involved in, and I was speaking with a new legislator, and I said, hey, do you know Dave Owen? And it was before you had approached this person and spoken with them. And I was trying to explain who Dave is and what he does, and there was no explanation. Anyway, but
There are two things that I could put on my card. One is the break glass guy, right, Kim?
Yeah, break glass in
Case
emergency.
of emergency. And that's what people do. And then the other thing is there's this guy.
Yeah, there's
Right.
this guy. And if you've had to call Dave, that's not good. But
Can I say one thing though? Because can I tell what your response was? Dave wrote a speech for me. And I said, hey, Dave, what do I owe you for that speech? And he said, don't worry about it, Carolyn. You can't afford me. And my response was, awesome. Thanks for the free speech. It was amazing.
okay, but so Dave has been enlisted as an advocate for some of these residential treatment centers here in Utah. And so,
Well, I'll tell you what happened back during the passage of it. Was it 129? Wasn't it SB 129?
I don't know the bill number.
I think that's what it was.
Okay.
One of the lobbyists, and I won't say who, but one of the guys called me and said, would you be willing to work? You know, they've got all these problems. It wasn't one of their lobbyists, wasn't a lobbyist for NATSAP. And then Megan called me. And since then, every time there's been a program with some kind of issue with the state or a press story coming, Megan's been great to me. She just says, there's this guy, you know, here's his number, and they call me. So I've become involved with a number of the programs. And I know quite a lot more about it than I did, you know, say 2 years ago. And I've become, I mean, you guys know me, I'm kind of an advocate anyway.
Yeah.
But I really have become an advocate for this industry. And I think that they're being treated poorly in some respects. I don't know if Megan talked about it. The new director of the Division of Licensing, I think, is trying to turn a corner.
Nice.
In his pronouncements in the press, he has definitely lowered the temperature. And he's not, he doesn't seem to be trying to score points. And from what I'm hearing from the people on the other side, the people in the industry, is that he seems to be trying to conduct it as, okay, we're all grown-ups here. Let's sit down and figure this out. There's a problem here. How do we correct it? And I'm all for that. I think everybody is. Yeah. I think NATSAP, I think if there are bad actors out there in the industry, if there are bad programs, I think they'll stand arm in arm with the regulators to get rid of them. Has been my observation, at least, and I'm seeing it from a pretty good standpoint.
Well, but often you have legislation and the subsequent regulations formed around trying to catch the bad actors, and sometimes it just goes too far and captures the ones that aren't the bad actors in the industry. And that's kind of my understanding of what's happened here is what have been the unintended consequences of the law and the regulation that sought to do a good thing. But
I've said to you, we're allowing Paris Hilton to determine our policy on residential treatment for kids.
Dave,
in the
that's
state
where
of
we
Utah.
are.
To me, that's like letting Greta Thunberg run your energy policy.
Well,
and
we do
go
that.
ask
We
Europe,
do.
call Europe and ask them how that's working out.
Yeah, we do that
I mean, what in
too.
the world is Paris Hilton? I'll tell you what, here's a book nobody's waiting for. Helpful Parenting Tips by Paris Hilton. You know, and the other thing is these are paid advocates. They use it to make money and to raise money. They use sensational stories.
Yeah.
The press loves it because they get the nasty headlines. The Tribune has absolutely been shameless on this. They should be ashamed. If there was any shame left in the press, they would be ashamed. But of course, we all know there isn't, so they're not.
Yeah.
And so they've treated these people absolutely unfairly. And these advocates do not share the values of the parents. These parents have been pushed to the brink. Everybody thinks that it's a matter of, oh, the kid's smarting off too much and he missed a couple of days of school. No, we're talking about very serious behavioral programs when you're talking about parents. Then when you get into Maple Lake Academy, and I don't want to go too deep on that because they're still, I wanted their ownership and administration to be on with us. But they're still on a conditional license. They had a real flap with the regulators. That's one where Mr. Bolivar, I think is how he says his name, stepped up, and he's, I think, been much more professional, and I think he is trying to do a good job. So I don't want to sit and hack on him because I really am hopeful that that's a turning of the corner. But Maple Lake, for example, the Tribune writes all these stories about how they talk to former students and this and that, and they never happen to mention that the kids that Maple Lake works with are ASD1. They're on the autism spectrum.
Oh, wow.
Now, most of them are high IQ, high function, but they're still autistic. To go to those kids, I don't want to say anything pejorative because I don't feel that way, obviously, but you have to filter it. You have to filter the information that you get from them. And the Tribune just prints it like it's, oh, these poor children, they've been so abused.
Yeah.
And then you get into Havenwood, you heard about the kids. Well, let me tell you something, maybe Ken didn't say it. And there's something from a parent that he just texted me. I looked up some numbers, and you can go on Google and find this stuff. And in round numbers, when you talk about foster girls who are in the foster system, who age out, so they turn 18, the state no longer has a role with them, and they haven't received any kind of treatment. They've just been in the foster system. Over 60% end up on the street. They end up homeless. You want to know who's living down on 7th South in Salt Lake City? It's the people that couldn't get the treatment when they needed it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's going on. And I want to read this that Ken sent. And there was a parent who wished she would have said it. So I'm going to just read what she had to say. She says that with the loss of treatment, we'll have even more parents who disrupt and give their kids up that they have adopted. She says it's happening in droves already. And those that can't get care are giving away their kids because they can't handle them. Now, what becomes of them? I can tell you what becomes of them. They end up on the street. And those girls probably end up with a drug problem, and they probably end up getting trafficked.
Yeah.
And so that's what the state has done by eliminating all, what do they call it? They can be called painful restraints, which sounds terrible, but it's like non-harmful holds. They have to be able to restrain some of these kids because they can't be controlled. And if you can't treat them. And if you don't treat them, they end up on the street. That's the problem that I have with it. And that's why I've become such a major advocate. When Maple Lake, their license was suspended and they weren't going to be able to take, I was on Zoom calls with a dozen or so parents who have kids in that school. And to hear them talk about Maple Lake and what they have done with their these were girls. There is a boys program. I haven't had experience on that side of things, but the parents were from all over the country and they could not say enough good things. And there was a death at Maple Lake. It's been in the newspaper. That's public record. I don't want to violate the family's private. All I can tell you is what was in the Tribune and what was said by a sitting Utah legislator in that article was all untrue. It completely lacked basis and fact. And there's a lot to be told. And there's a lot to be told about Paris Hilton's little sob story. But guess what? People are constrained by HIPAA.
Yes.
They can't talk, they can't defend themselves. So these critics can go out and tell a good story, and these people are completely handcuffed. They can't say a word because it involves HIPAA, because involves patient privacy.
Yeah.
And so it's really up to the parents or the kids to talk. A lot of the Maple Lake parents would be willing to do this. We just couldn't put any of them together for tonight. But they just tell wonderful stories about what things were like when they had that child at home, how long they waited and how hard they searched to find help. There are about 2 places in the country that fit these kids, and Maple Lake's one of them, and it's very limited. And what has happened with their child since then. And I've spoken with parents who have their kids home from the program, and the change is lasting. These are kids that have now been able to go on and complete their educations because they are high IQ and high function. Yeah. They just have difficulties. And you layer upon that some emotional and psychological issues as well. And it's a very complex. Maple Lake is not about misbehaving teenagers. It is an honest to goodness therapeutic center, as is 3 Points down in, I was just there, Hurricane, and of course Havenwood. These are serious therapeutic institutions, and there are those involved in this politically, both legislatively and then these critics that want to paint everything with the same brush, and they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, Dave, I spent a number of years on a foster care review board in the early 90s after the state got sued for our foster care system, or mid 90s. And I remember having parents come in. So we reviewed cases, parents, we'd interview parents, the caseworkers, and the individual in care and make recommendations to the judges. But I remember parents saying there are no options sometimes. And you made this point. I cannot take care of this child on my own. I hate to turn them over to the state, but it's the only way I can get this problem solved. Right.
Yeah. And in some cases, the state backstops those foster parents. And that's why a lot of the girls at Havenwood, for example, are state pay because they backstop these, because a lot of these kids have been adopted. And you know this, Carolyn, better than I do. And maybe they were an alcohol fetal syndrome child.
Or reactive attachment.
Or mom was a drug addict or had some other organic mental disease. Nobody really knows. And so this is a tough thing to ask parents to do without giving them some kind of support.
Yeah. And if we're going to complain about the treatment of children, it seems to me that when 60% of the children, of the girls raised by the state end up on the street, I don't know. Maybe we ought to be asking some questions about the care that is taking place when these kids are turned over.
I don't know that you can. You can ask the questions, and that's valid. But the reality is, if they don't get into a loving, supportive, constructive environment, they're not going to make it. I mean, some will. Obviously, there's some miracles out there, but for the most part, you're simply not going to see favorable outcomes.
Right. But
and just having them in foster care or in some kind of institutional. The other option is that these girls go to juvie and sit there for 18 months until they age out.
Right.
That's a wonderful
But here's the thing that I struggle with, and that is and I'm not saying that kids ought to be left in those situations either, but we have a state that oftentimes acts as God in families. And I'll tell you, I have talked to grown adults who were in situations as children where even though it wasn't ideal, they feared the state taking, and these weren't kids who were physically abused either, but where there may have been some neglect and some financial disruption and uncertainty. Those kids would have done anything to stay with their parent as opposed to being taken. And that was their biggest fear. And I wonder sometimes if in our, I call them the do-gooders, the people who think that they can solve all the problems for others, oftentimes while their own lives are messes. But I think sometimes this intervention by the state is so misguided that we end up with worse problems.
Well, but that's going to change because we now have a new family czar who's going to fix all these family issues.
Yeah, that'll take care of it. We all know that government in general, politics certainly, is one big living example of unintended consequence.
Yep.
It happens at every level and in every aspect. And certainly it does with these kids. And one of those things is when they did 129, albeit well intended, it makes me mad that Paris Hilton had a gun to everybody's head, and these guys let themselves be taken hostage, and so they were afraid to vote against it. And I'm working so that won't happen again.
Yeah.
But by passing the bill that they did, they have sentenced dozens, if not hundreds, of children to age out of the foster system or to spend their time in juvie because they can't be treated therapeutically. Right. And they have sentenced them to a life of despair.
Yeah. Yeah.
There. How's that for a close?
That was, I was going to say great. It really isn't. It's depressing.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible. Does the bill need to change, or can some of this be guardrailed in the regulation?
Yeah, I think that's what needs to happen. They need to revise some of that and take certain, and I think this new director, he may be a guy that is willing to look at those things and be a little broader on it and not so reactive to the emotion of the moment and the desire to get on TV.
Yeah.
I think he seems so far to be making some very good moves, and I'm hopeful for the industry. And you know why I'm hopeful for the industry? Because that's hopeful for the kids.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Emotion of the moment and desire to get on TV is not how we drive good policy. I think that's what we can take away from this.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much
Dave.
for joining us, Dave. Have a good night.
My pleasure. Thank you. From lovely Arizona.
Oh, nice. Thanks.
All right. Well,
yeah, that hopefully a lot of these things can be mitigated / fixed and dealt with kind of on the regulatory side.
yeah. Well, and this is, I mean, this is a common theme that we cover on this podcast is being, first of all, not being legislators in the first place that are, easily dazzled by shiny objects. And then on the regulation side, that it is that constant story of regulation trying to find the right balance of protecting health and safety without going too far. And we've just frequently failed at that. So, all righty. Well, thank you for joining us for another segment of Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn. And make sure to please follow us, like us, give us some shares wherever you find your podcasts. And
thank you, Fosmu.
Thank Fosmu.
Yeah, this episode's been a lot to chew.
Yeah.
A lot to think about.
Definitely some very heavy topics in the area of mental health that.
We've had a couple recently.
Yeah. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.